During the 1960s, African Americans were declaring that black is beautiful. We wore afros, dashikis, and we called ourselves brothers and sisters. And we generally were proud of our African heritage. Today, to the contrary, many African Americans now perceive being black as synonymous with being ghetto. And instead of proudly wearing afros, dashikis, and calling ourselves brothers and sisters, many now shamefully conceal our beautiful African hair beneath European weaves, sags our pants, and calls ourselves by the N-word and the B-word. This drastic reversal of black pride within the African American communities is not a natural occurrence. It's by deliberate design. White social scientists hired by the Kerner Commission determined that the unprecedented unified black protest during the 1960s was due to an elevated and unifying black collective self-esteem brought on by the emergence of that decade's Black Pride movement. To remedy what was then called the U.S. Negro problem, white social scientists and white propagandists were hired to negatively steer the African American culture away from the Black Pride movement. They did it by utilizing many hidden nefarious social engineering tactics. Those who know the truth must teach, African proverb. Throughout history, those nations that were extremely racist and oppressive did not abandon those proclivities and practices very easily. They most often reinvented those practices with much more sophistication. They instead developed methods that are better suited with the changing times and methods that are not as easily recognized by the black victims. This is the hidden reality that presently confronts black people presently living under white dominance. Although most black people today no longer experience the same type of blatant white racist subjugation tactics as our grandparents had experienced them, we are, however, still victims of systemic white racist oppressive subjugation tactics. During the 1960s, it was determined by white social scientists that the first aggravating factor for that decade's unprecedented unified black protest against the white establishment was due to blatant white racism. They therefore logically determined that it was time to abandon the blatant Jim Crow segregation tactics used in the past for maintaining white social dominance over the black population, and that it was time to develop more covert methods for meeting that objective. It was time to develop methods that are not as easily recognized nor as easily comprehended by their black victims. The white racist subjugation of black people always works best when the black victims no longer recognizes how it works. Those white social scientists determined that the second aggravating factor for that decade's unprecedented unified black protest was caused by an elevated and unifying black collective self-esteem brought on by the emergence of the Black Pride movement. They therefore logically determined that unified black protests could be subdued by keeping the collective self-esteems of the black masses very low. It was determined that this could be achieved by subliminally changing black is beautiful into black is ugly, black is ghetto, black is violent, and that blacks are criminals. And it could also be achieved by perpetually keeping the black masses believing that the fraudulent worst possible narratives about ourselves. This is the true real reason why all narratives that we receive from white sources about black people are consistently negative and black racially demoralizing. When you critically think and open your eyes, can you not see just how cartoonishly unrealistic that scenario actually is? Everything about us are consistently negative. Some African Americans have been so heavily demoralized by the white society's negative distorted depictions of our racial group that many become self-loathing and many try to separate themselves from the black community. This control system utilizes the immense power that shame has upon the human mind to covertly subjugate and control the black masses. Some black people have been so deeply demoralized by the white society's fraudulent negative depictions of our racial group that many literally find it easier to continue believing the fraudulent worst about ourselves than to accept the truth that we're being lied to about our collective state as a means of controlling and subduing black protest. It is the truth of our plight and condition. It was also determined a significant factor that for black unity was that during the 1960s, African American culture changed. We started calling ourselves brothers and sisters during the 60s. Repeated words have power over the subconscious minds. Therefore, by repeatedly calling ourselves brothers and sisters, this had a profoundly unifying effect upon the African American culture. So it was decided to erode that unity. They used social engineering tactics to socially engineer the African American culture away from calling ourselves brothers and sisters to now calling ourselves by the N word and the B word. This makes it easier to divide our ranks. White social scientists determined that a third aggravating factor from the 1960s unprecedented unified black protests was because millions of African Americans had developed an allegiance towards Africa, and that hindered the growth of our black patriotism towards the U.S. government. African Americans' allegiance towards Africa was very strong during the 1960s. This was made evident by the fact that many African Americans had started wearing afros, cornrows, dashikis, and many were giving themselves African names. White social scientists determined that millions of African Americans had developed a romanticized allegiance towards Africa that prevented black allegiance and patriotism from growing towards the U.S. Moreover, that this allegiance fueled the Black Pride movement and the Black Power movement, which was the core aggravating factor for that decade's unprecedented unified black protest. They therefore decided that African Americans' allegiance toward Africa had to be eroded. To do this, they had turned Africa into a source of shame and humiliation for African Americans. To achieve this, white propagandists were hired to negatively distort the image of Africa. They constantly subject African Americans to seeing only those images of war-torn, famine-ridden, rapidly illiterate, and disease-stricken Africa, while never showing the beautiful parts of Africa. By only showing the poorest parts of Africa, this turned Africa into a source of shame and humiliation for many African Americans. You see, it's easier to separate people from something they've been made to feel ashamed of. Those negative depictions of Africa also subliminally conveys the message that we African Americans that we actually benefited from slavery, because it makes us perceive the enslavement of our ancestors as having been more of a rescue mission that ultimately brought us away from the terrible, scary place of Africa. This is why many African Americans say, I'm happy slavery happened. We feel indebted to the white society. This propaganda campaign literally causes many African Americans to feel grateful that slavery happened. This significantly eases African American collective aggressions against the white society and redirected towards ourselves. It also broke down African American sense of black racial heritage and allegiance towards Africa. Keeping us believing the fraudulent worst narratives about ourselves is how the white society now prevents us from unifying against them. The fact is, the white society writes all black societal narratives. They write our history. They control how we're depicted within most movies and TV shows. They control how we're depicted in the news. They control our statistics, our health study results. They tell us what to think about black men and what black men think about black women. They therefore literally owns black people's interpretation of ourselves. And white social scientists determined a long time ago that they can control us by keeping us believing the fraudulent, worst possible narratives about ourselves. People are easily controlled by the information that they receive about themselves, especially when they're unaware of what's being done to them, when they're unaware that the information is being distorted to invoke specific responses from them. When people are constantly fed fraudulent, negative, demoralizing information about themselves, They become demoralized, divided, self-loathing, and they become more compliant with the oppressor's dominance over their lives. In fact, many will even prefer it. It also creates self-hatred and disunity, which attacks the core foundation of what bonds a people, and they can then be ruled over forever. And it doesn't matter that the information presented to the targeted population is untrue. The only thing that matters is that the targeted populations are misled to believe that the information is true. People function based on their perception of what's true. This nefarious psychological warfare tactic works by tapping into the immense power that shame has upon the human mind to mentally enslave millions of black people. And those black people who don't critically think never notices their mental change. Our condition has nothing to do with a silly slave syndrome myth. A Jesus from a Bible written by our most ungodliest enemies and that was brutally beaten into the minds of our enslaved ancestors will not come back and now save us. Our minds are being kept in a delusional state by believing in falsehood. There are social sciences. The white society exploits its monopoly over information that we receive to shape our minds and beliefs in ways that serves and protects the system of white supremacy. It's time to wake up to our reality. One love and peace.